Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore Shakespeare's great work, Richard III. One of the other great dramas of Shakespeare that deals with the idea and the politics of regime change is Richard III. One of his earlier historical plays, Richard III is nonetheless a masterpiece of the Shakespearean canon. In it, we find the themes of love and power, once again, politics, tyranny, and isolation, once again. Yet, this play, unlike some of his other historical plays, the Roman plays, ends on a hopeful note, and we will explore why that is. What makes Richard III such a shocking play is how it showcases the extent to which a person, an individual, will go to usurp power. Richard III, unlike the other plays in which we see the politics of tyranny, say in Hamlet, or even in the Roman plays like Antony and Cleopatra, which focuses on Antony and Cleopatra and not Octavius, Richard III, the petty tyrant, is the main character of this play. Richard III wishes to prove himself a villain. He openly says it, and so has his brother murdered to seal his face as one of the immortal villains of English literature. Like the good black operation that it has to be, Richard hires expendable third-party executioners instead of getting his own hands dirty. Yet, in his aside, as he said, he wishes to prove himself a villain. Furthermore, Richard has totally and entirely forsaken the realities of love in his pursuit of power. His courting and marrying of Lady Anne exposes the hollowness of his affection, as the marriage is simply for political ends. Richard, nevertheless, feigns repentance and forgiveness like any good two-faced politico. But his marriage with Lady Anne is purely for show. It only serves a political purpose. And no one, not even the sacred ties of his family, as his brother learned, are free from Richard's machinations. Murder ascends Richard to the throne, and murder is how Richard attempts to maintain his power. And here we see a nice contrast with regard to Claudius in Hamlet. Claudius attempted to maintain power through the security surveillance state. Richard III attempts to maintain his power through the brutal realities of murder. Like Cain, Richard is a fugitive of the law he is meant to uphold, and he simply bends and distorts the law for his own political and power purposes. Richard's descent into paranoia ends with more murder. As he continues to grow mad and paranoid, his only recourse is to more murder. The blood of England must flow if he is to maintain his rule as king. Buckingham, an erstwhile champion of Richard, sees himself on the way out, like Soviet lieutenants during the Great Purge. No amount of loyal service can protect one from the vain insanity of a tyrant who has sold everything to usurp power. Richard's regime change ends, as we know, in civil war. During the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Richard cries that most famous line, "A horse, my kingdom for a horse," we realize just how fragile political power is, after all. For all the power and the state infrastructure Richard had at his disposal, from his ascent to his fall, a simple horse was all he cried out for, when it was all vanishing and slipping away in the blood and fire of civil war. Richard III is also the scourge over England for having deposed Richard II in another regime change prior to his murdering his way to power, and Shakespeare details this in his play Richard II. A long train of abuses and tragedy befalls England for having committed the first act of regime change prior to Richard's life, which leads to the culmination of his brutal politics in the backstabbing, murder, and civil war dramatized in the play. What was born in blood must end in blood. We also see, interestingly enough, how isolated and lonely Richard has become over the course of the play. And here is a great moment of Shakespearean genius. The further we slip into tyranny and totalitarianism, the more isolated and lonely we become. From individuals suffering under the society of tyranny to the tyrant themselves, loneliness and isolation is what is always wrought by the politics of tyranny and totalitarianism. True, in some manner, he was always isolated to begin with, but he was only a scheming man with grandiose intentions at the beginning of the play, and spoke to the audience as if having a conversation. There was some sort of relationship that Richard had with us, with his audience, in his asides before his complete descent into tyranny and totalitarianism. Once the veil was cut, however, we see that he loses everything. His mother and his friends slowly fade away into the background as they either disappear or are brutally murdered by him. Eventually, the asides that Richard was giving to us as an audience, as he declared himself to want to be the great villain, eventually disappear too. No longer do we, the audience, hear Richard talking to us. Richard is completely alone. As the play develops, Richard seizes the power, loses his friends, loses his family, and we, the audience, lose him as a character. This is the complete descent into tyranny and totalitarianism, complete isolation and loneliness. Those endearing but cunning asides inserted into the play have also disappeared, just as his family, just as his friends. So now, by the end of the play, Richard is but an empty shell of a man, completely alone, deprived of family and friends, and even us as the audience. And for Shakespeare, this is important for us to realize. However cute we might think Richard's sinister asides were at the beginning, once we see him become the true tyrant that he is, we realize he is alone, he is isolated, and we too become alone and isolated as an audience, as the subjects of Richard's cruel kingdom. Whenever the politics of tyranny and totalitarianism assert themselves, an isolated, lonely world is what is created. Civil war, first and foremost, is associated with political usurpation. Richard's usurpation culminates not in dark dungeons and chained cell rooms, as most of us would think in a world of tyranny, darkness, and totalitarianism. We find a world in which complete isolation and loneliness is one manifestation of tyranny, and on the other, neighbor fighting neighbor as civil war erupts. Brother fights brother. The sacred bond of family and land evaporate as the sword of war rears its ugly head. And that is Shakespeare's warning to us about the politics that we might be experiencing in our own lives. If we see neighbor fighting neighbor, brother fighting brother, families torn apart, if we find ourselves isolated and alone, if our own leaders seem isolated and alone, we are living in the chains of tyranny. Not a chain and not a dungeon that makes it apparent, but a psychological and a brutal relational tyranny, one in which the heart of love cannot consummate what it ultimately seeks in life. Richard's death is met by that recurring image of Shakespeare, love in marriage. Richmond's marriage to Lady Elizabeth signifies the rebirth of war-torn England. How fitting it is that the rebirth of a shattered nation is in holy matrimony, with the prospects of a fertile womb giving birth to new life, a new family, and new relationships, the very relationships, family, and love that was shattered by Richard's tyranny. What Shakespeare so brilliantly reveals in Richard III is the horror of war wrought by political usurpation, what we might call regime change today, but more importantly, the brilliance of Shakespeare is in how the tyranny and the totalitarianism of Richard III manifests itself in lonely isolation and the decay and the destruction of all the sacred bonds of life and family and society. Shakespeare's own life, his adolescence and youthful maturation, was during the final days and aftermath of the saga of Mary, Queen of Scots. The prime of his life was intertwined with the Habsburg attempt to overthrow Elizabeth I and claim England for the Habsburg Empire. We see, in a close inspection of Shakespearean themes and ironies, the very concerns of the Elizabethan age brought to life on stage and in the movement of the dramas of Shakespeare's plays. Indeed, the drama of the Elizabethan age dominates Shakespeare's historical dramas. Civil war, usurpation, political legitimacy, tyranny, totalitarianism, the police state. These are not distant memories of the medieval past, as the choral introductions seem to suggest, but very recent memories, and indeed ongoing concerns during Shakespeare's own life. The drama of war that was so near to Shakespeare, the drama of tyranny and totalitarianism, the farce of bloody manhood and political scheming come to the fore in many of Shakespeare's English historical plays. Wars bring distrust, deceit, murder, hangings, scars, famine, the destruction of family, friendship, the destruction of love itself. The sword of war unleashed in the lust for power, manifesting itself in political usurpation, makes villains of us all, and a villain Richard III certainly was. The wisdom of Shakespeare in Richard III is exposing the naked horror of tyranny and totalitarianism, and indeed civil war, which is often brought about by political usurpation, and how the darkness, the dense darkness of this world has to be countered, not by more political calculation, but by the encounter and flourishing of love. Like all great poets whose theme is love, and unlike the political theorists whose theme is power, Shakespeare reminds us what is truly important in life. Thus, when Richmond marries Lady Elizabeth, we do not see their union and movement in the politics. What we see is their union in love, and how that image of marriage can bring about a rebirth of a desecrated and shattered nation, and how the prospects of that fertile womb, Lady Elizabeth's womb, will give birth to new life, and how in the birth of new life, the darkness, the tyranny, the totalitarianism, the isolation, and the loneliness that Richard III thrust upon the nation, and indeed thrust upon us as an audience, fades away. For we must remember that in Shakespeare, Shakespeare's contrasts of images are equally important. Richard III is a man alone and isolated. As a tyrant, he is alone and isolated. In the world he creates, we find loneliness and isolation. In his death and in the rebirth of the nation, through Richmond and Lady Elizabeth, we no longer find loneliness and isolation, but two becoming one in holy matrimony, with the prospect of life itself being the final image, the restoration of all that was lost under Richard's regime. Thus, Shakespeare gives us the great insight, the great knowledge, and the great hope that no matter how dark and how tyrannical our world seems to be, love is still possible, and only in the possibility of love can we overturn the politics of tyranny.